Hey, GrowWire listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the GrowWire podcast. I'm your host, Jason Maynard, and this week I'm sitting down with an award-winning technology writer and best-selling author of business books like Play Bigger and The 2-Second Advantage. Yes, people, it's Kevin Maney. Kevin is one of the best journalists around. He writes some amazing things. He's worked with all sorts of companies like Cisco, IBM. He was one of the leading technology journalists of the time, helped really kind of launch the technology section at the USA Today. He's got some great stories. In our interview, we're going to dive into some factors that talk about how companies tell stories, why it's important, the future of AI in some industries like healthcare, and how companies need to master the art of category design. So please enjoy this podcast with Kevin. Here we go.
You're listening to the GrowWire podcast, a place where you'll learn the ins and outs of growing a business, running a business, or even taking your big idea, career, or personal development to the next level. It's all possible. Our host, Jason Maynard, the SVP of Marketing at Oracle NetSuite and the Editor-in-Chief of GrowWire.com, will take you on an exploration of growth through candid conversations with some of the most brilliant minds in entrepreneurship, entertainment, business development, and more. Whatever your goal, we know you'll walk away with the right tools to help fuel your own journey of growth.
All right, before you get into our interview with Kevin Maney, I want to quickly thank Blue Microphones for supporting this episode of the GrowWire podcast. As you guys all know, everyone has a story to tell. And if you're a storyteller, you probably know Blue Mics for their iconic Yeti microphone, which has helped millions of people find and amplify their voices, just like my voice is being amplified right now. If you're thinking about creating your own podcast or recording music, check out Blue's new YetiCaster, the complete mic and boom arm system, ready to connect to your laptop, bringing the ultimate broadcast studio setup to your home or office. Visit bluedesigns.com and use the code PODCAST at checkout for a very, very special GrowWire price. I also want to make sure you head over to our website at growwire.com. That's right, growwire.com. Check it out. You're going to find all sorts of great articles about growing a business and your super awesome ideas. One of the best articles this week actually features one of Kevin's co-authors on Play Bigger, Christopher Lochhead. Christopher dives into category design. He gives practical advice for entrepreneurs who are starting out and what you need to do when you're going to launch your business, company, or product. Check it out, growwire.com. Thank you. Hey, Kevin, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate you coming in.
Thanks, Jason.
All right.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, New York City. So
Yeah.
It's good. It's a nice hot summer day in New York. We've got a little time to talk today, and Kevin, your background is impressive and amazing, and you've seen some pretty compelling transformations in the media business. You're a columnist, an author, and now category designer. I think for the benefit of the audience, give us a little bit of your background and how you ended up where you're at today.
Oh, geez. Okay. Well,
you're a New Yorker.
I am
native.
Well, I grew up in Binghamton, New York, about 3 hours from here, upstate New York.
You're an upstate New Yorker.
Yeah.
Do you still claim being a New Yorker with that?
No, actually, not really. I'm told you need to live in New York for a decade before you can claim to be a New Yorker. So I've got about another year to go.
Okay, my wife's from Connecticut, and she always claims that she's a longtime New Yorker.
See, that's false advertising.
Well, she lived here 11 years. And she's like, no, I lived here 11 years, so I'm a New Yorker.
She made it over the line.
She made it over the line. But I was like, those Connecticut years can't count.
Right, exactly.
That's
commuting to New York.
Yeah, commuting. Yeah,
no.
That doesn't work. Yeah.
Well, the Binghamton thing is part of the story, actually, because the Binghamton area, the town right next to Binghamton is a little town called Endicott, New York. Endicott, New York is essentially where IBM was born. And until the 1980s, 1990s, was like the gigantic presence in town. And so I went to school, college. I knew from the time I was probably in junior high school that I wanted to be a writer. I mean, I just loved that communication style. And so I went to school for journalism, got out of college and took a job with the Binghamton newspaper in my hometown. And I remember actually that there were 2 job openings where they called me, and one of them was for the night cops reporter, and the other was for a business reporter. Now, I had no business background whatsoever, but I thought about the idea of being a night cops reporter, and I thought, I think I'm going to be a business reporter.
Imagine where you'd have gone if you'd have been the night cops reporter.
I know, yeah, I'd be on, like a hard copy or something now. But
TMZ would have been your calling.
Yeah. So yeah, chasing ambulances around at 3 a.m. didn't sound like fun. So I took the business reporter job, and if you're going to be a business reporter at the Binghamton Evening Press, you're going to cover IBM.
Yeah.
And so they threw me into that. I knew nothing about business, I knew nothing about technology, but I, for whatever set of reasons, was fascinated by what they were doing and what all this was about and everything. And so I really latched on to covering that aspect of things, and then moved on to another good newspaper, and eventually wound up at USA Today in its very earliest years as a technology reporter. And so that was what launched me into that whole part of the career.
Yeah, and you were at the USA Today for many, many years.
I was there for 22 years.
Yeah, so you saw not only the rise of USA Today, but also a big change in the technology landscape during that time.
Well, I joined them in 1985. The paper was just barely out of the parking space yet.
It launched in what, 84? 83?
It was about a year before that, I think. And it was still the sparse newsroom. Just
I actually remember when it was launched. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I ended up. The reason I was there for so long was because I basically it was like joining a startup that takes off, right?
Yeah.
There's multiple phases. You get to essentially be at a renewed company every couple of years because it's growing so fast. And and by the mid 90s it was the biggest newspaper in the country. So I rode that gigantic wave up through 2000. The paper was just minting money.
Yeah.
Around I was covering the whole internet explosion, the dot-com explosion in the late 90s. I knew what was starting to happen. I could see what was going on in what this was going to do to media. In fact, the very first book I wrote was this book called Mega Media Shakeout.
Yeah.
It came out in 1995, and the whole book essentially was about what happens when media goes digital. Nobody was even talking. It was the first book that was about media going digital, and so I started actually getting sucked in. I was just a reporter, columnist, whatever, but I started getting sucked into board meetings at Gannett to talk about what is this internet thing and what does it mean? And I actually convinced the CEO at one point that at some point you might be running an operation that has no printing presses, and he was amazed.
But it's funny that we in the mid 90s it was new media.
Yeah.
Right. We called it new media. Right. And there was all this sort of fascination about what this world was going to look like, but it was so far off from being diffused into the masses that it was. I know it's hard for folks to realize today, but it was still this pie in the sky idea that you would have this sort of massive secular shift away.
It was, but having been in the inside of this, I think it's really fascinating to me to think about, because there's the whole innovator's dilemma thing, right, that gets documented. And I mean, I saw this close up because it wasn't that the newspaper industry didn't understand or see this coming or know what was happening out there, because I was in those board meetings. I know they knew.
Yeah.
And they still couldn't do anything about it. And I watched them move so incredibly slowly and so incredibly clunkily towards this whole internet thing. And and because of course in those days an advertisement in the print paper was worth 100 times more than the same ad on the web, the website. So you couldn't. Classic innovator's dilemma. Here's where all the money is. Here's the future. We can't give up where the money is to chase the future, and possibly cannibalize the cash cow. And so they just, it was what happens to so many industries, and then they just held on to that, that anchor until it drowned them.
Did they? When you were in those meetings, was there was obviously a recognition of what was happening, so that wasn't the issue. Was the challenge? How do you actually make the transition? How do you sort of subsidize, if you will, or take money from the cash cow and put it into the new thing and figure out when those lines cross?
Well, that is the challenge, and I mean, first of all, you have to take it seriously enough, which it took them too long to take it
Yeah.
seriously enough. And then, and then, again, classically, realize that this new media, if more and more readers piled into that and more advertisers piled into that and away from the newspaper, revenues were going to get
Crushed.
Crushed.
Yeah.
And then you got a public company, you got Wall Street on your back,
Yep.
blah, blah, blah. And it really, it does tie the hands of even good, smart people. To be in those situations. It's happened to it's happening to retail today. It's happening go look around. How many industries do you see this happen to? They all know. They all could read the paper or listen
Read
to your
their tablets.
podcast and know exactly what's happening, but they can't do anything about it.
Yeah, it's very difficult to make that move, and you're right. You see it a lot across a lot of industries. It's always fascinating to me the ones that make the transition, who decide they're gonna. And it's not a question of burning the boats, but it's how do you actually invest enough to be relevant with the new model, and plot that course. And it's really hard to do. And you see it in the software industry. Hardware companies have had a challenge, so it's really across the board. Mm-hmm. What after USA Today though? What was your sort of catalyst to move on from USA Today?
Well, it was some of what we're talking about.
Okay.
It was getting into it was the early 2000s. I could see what was happening to budgets and to newsroom size and understand what was happening in the industry. And I started to think of, I needed a next phase. And luckily I had something come along that was really kind of cool. And I don't know if you remember, but there was Condé Nast, the huge magazine company, decided to start a new business magazine called Portfolio.
I remember that, yeah.
And
they put a lot of money into that.
Pumped a lot of money into it. And the idea of Portfolio was that it was going to be like a Vanity Fair of the business world. Actually, a really smart idea. And I got recruited to be one of the original staff members. And actually, fantastic experience because I was surrounded by some of the best editors and writers I've ever known, and they've become my friends and colleagues for the rest of my career. But started doing this great magazine, launched in 2007, 2008, financial crisis hits, Condé Nast gets in all sorts of trouble, so they closed the magazine about 2.5 years after it launched. But that whole experience kind of launched me into a new phase of life past the newspaper and onto other things.
Yeah. When you look at the media landscape today, it's it's kind of fascinating, and we're going to talk about your latest book, Unscaled. The media companies today appear to be trying to scale up marrying content and distribution like they haven't in a long time, right? In terms of the AT&T deal and obviously the bidding for Fox assets. What's your view on, given that you wrote a book about unscaling, what's your commentary on the scaling that's going on in the media business today?
Well, so generally speaking, let's even decouple it from media.
Yeah. Generally
speaking, when you look around and you see giant mega mergers happen, they're happening because something new is challenging that industry.
Yeah.
And so the old guard of the industry, the AT&Ts and Time Warners and Disneys or whatever, are looking for any way to, merge and save money and, create scale, because they think that's what's going to defend them against the new wave of the Netflixes of the world and and YouTubes and all these other things that are happening and taking our attention away from what the old giants did. So that giant scaling up of those giant mergers is not an offensive. That's a defensive measure.
Strategy, yeah.
And clearly, right now, those guys are all afraid of Netflix. And Netflix, we can get into this later in the story, but Netflix is just such a perfect example of what unscaling is all about and why that wins ultimately.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because it feels like there is a panic or a ripple going through this business where this
absolutely
tying together
and with good reason.
Yeah, tying together business models that probably don't fit
right
for what the future is going to look like. They may have fit in the past, but it's going to have to.
And there's no question that the big money machine of classic cable television is, it's got a line that was only going in one direction, and that's down.
Yeah, the cord cutting phenomena is not
absolutely
it's going to head in a different direction. Well, let's take a quick break, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of your book collaborations.
Okay.
All right.
Which American company started with a guy in a garage, was featured on Shark Tank, and now has over 1 million customers? Hint, they're reducing crime in neighborhoods everywhere. Here's Ring Video Doorbell founder Jamie Siminoff with his secret to success.
It's true. In just a few years, we've had huge growth. We've hired hundreds of people, expanded our warehouse, and we're shipping millions of units a year, all while making sure our customers are happy. I've had lots of things to worry about, but I never worry about our finance and accounting because we use NetSuite from Oracle. From the beginning, NetSuite let me see what's going on with my business in real time, from revenues to expenses, customers and orders, even HR. I run my business from a dashboard right on my phone. NetSuite has been my business management system from 10 to a team of over 1,000, and NetSuite will be my choice as we continue to innovate and grow.
Go to netsuite.com/ring to see how Jamie scaled his business. You'll also get our free guide titled Overcoming Your 5 Obstacles to Growth. That's netsuite.com/ring for your free guide and the story of a great American company. netsuite.com/ring.
So one of the fascinating things that I learned when I was doing a little bit more research is that you were the author of some of my favorite books.
Accidentally.
I didn't realize that. So, and which kind of, it was interesting to me. So, your most recent book, Unscaled, talks about how AI and new technology is changing the business landscape. But before that, you wrote a book with Christopher Lochhead and the team from Play Bigger about category design. But before that, you wrote a book on the history of IBM, which I now figure out why you're so interested in IBM given your background. But you also did a book with Vivek Ranadive,
right,
the founder of TIBCO and now the owner of the Sacramento Kings, called The 2-Second Advantage.
Yeah.
And so I remember reading The 2-Second Advantage. Gosh, this was how many years ago?
2011, I
yeah.
think it came out.
Yeah, when Vivek was really talking about where TIBCO was going with real-time business and everything. And so what was fascinating to me is that it appears that you have found a model here where you frame these technology transformations in a way that makes it really easy for anyone to read and understand. Was this an intentional strategy, or how did you get into this business?
A little intentional, a little unintentional. Well, first of all, certainly my I've a decade plus of being the technology columnist for USA Today. My job was to explain complex technology to my mother, essentially, right?
And that was the audience for USA Today. It was the mass market.
And so I got used to doing that, and so that was the skill essentially that translated into those kinds of books. But I kind of stumbled across this great little, it's worked well for me, this model with Vivek, really. Because to that point, all the books I'd done were just ones that I just did.
Yeah.
And so Vivek wanted to do a book. He had some ideas, and somebody introduced us. We set up a meeting. He and I had a conversation. He kind of told me all about his idea. And I had a book in the back of my mind, or an idea in the back of my mind, for quite some time that I always wanted to do. And the book I wanted to do had something to do with brain science and what the science was behind why we're talented at something.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And that actually comes out of a long friendship with Jeff Hawkins, the guy who founded Palm Computing, and then is a closet brain scientist. I mean, yes, he is actually, so Vivek started talking about this whole thing about where he sees computing technology going, basically describing what we're now all familiar with AI and predictive machines.
The application of brain science to a certain extent.
And I listened to him, and I said, that's really interesting, because I've been thinking for a long time about this brain science aspect of things. And if you take the description of why brain science says talent works, and apply it to what you're saying about what you want computers to be able to do, they're very similar. so let's look into that. And we started to talk about it and talk to people outside and realized that the computer scientists and brain scientists were starting to really talk to each other and share research about working on trying to make computers smart actually helped inform the brain scientists about how they can research what we do with our brains.
Yeah.
And as they learned about how brains work, of course, it inform how computer scientists would think about artificial intelligence. So the book became a book about that intersection of that conversation, and what they were learning from each other and what that tells us about where computing technology is going to go. And like for to say, it came out in 2011, which was kind of unfortunate, because if it came out in like 2016, it would have been right on the money of where the conversation was going.
Well, but what was fascinating to me at the time was and I was following, in my prior life as an analyst, I was following TIBCO back in those days. And TIBCO obviously had this raw technology of middleware, right? A message-oriented middleware powering, some of the most, sophisticated applications like trading desks and things like that. But it was always the application benefit that you got out of the technology, right, in terms of how you could really harness the power, which where that company was going, they didn't call it AI, right? But it was clearly that application of how do you take brain science and make, not necessarily eliminate a job, but make a frontline customer service worker smarter, or somebody in a bank smarter, or figure out some problem about how do you reward loyalty for if you're running a cruise line or something like that. So that was the piece that I remember when the book came out, and was that you guys harnessed the business value, and it appears to be that's one of your skills, or in a lot of your books, is how do you harness this to tell that story?
And well, I mean, part of it is just always looking at it through that lens of here's this cool thing, but let's figure out what it actually means, and how it's going to change the way we do things or the way businesses work. And then also part of it is just making sure you pull in a lot of find the relevant real life stories that tell that story, so that it becomes tangible and applicable to the way business actually works. And actually, when in doing these books, part of it is like I got an MBA just working on these books, because I got to sit next to somebody like Vivek, who's a CEO, or Chris Lockhead and the Play Bigger team, who've been deep in the heart of startups and advising startups and all that, and I would bring my knowledge of how to write about these things, but the business education I got from those people was amazing.
Yeah. So Play Bigger was, I think, one of the most influential books in the last few years, because it really, I think it explained some of the market dynamics that were happening that I think some people intuitively knew, but could never really put a finger on why, right? And sort of capture the why. How did you guys go about really building that idea of category design?
And category design, by the way, as a term, came out of the sessions we did with them.
Oh, interesting.
We did together.
You designed your own category?
Because they weren't calling it that before. But the other three authors, Chris Lockhead, Al Ramadan, Dave Peterson, the three of them already had a firm called Play Bigger that was advising. They'd all been CMOs and CEOs and founders and stuff, but now for a few years they'd had a firm that was advising startups, and their whole central premise was that if you're going to be a startup, you need to try to be a category king. And they described how, like in digital markets, which we now all kind of understand that that for the most part, winner takes all in any category in a digital market. So you want to be the winner, obviously. You don't want to be second place, you get some crumbs. Third place, you get hardly anything. And so they thought there was a book idea around that. I, with my journalism hat on, after a few conversations, thought this really is interesting. It's original. It's worth exploring and doing something about. So we spent a lot of time. Al is a data scientist, so he ran a bunch of data on VC-backed companies that we could help us inform what we're looking at. They had a lot of their own stories. I went out and did a lot of other research by interviewing, people who had accidentally done category design, but done it really well. People like Diane Greed at VMware and Mark Benioff at Salesforce, and we just started to put together this idea of how to how the best companies can define and develop and then ultimately dominate a new category of business, and why that's a smart strategy.
Yeah.
So the first part of the book is really sets up why that's happening, and it gets into the whole thing about digital markets and winner takes all, and some of the data that we ran about why companies, certain kinds of companies create value and certain ones that don't. And then the back 2/3 of the book is really an instruction manual, like how do the best do this, and how you know, if you're running a company, how do you think this way?
Yeah. Well, it's funny when the book came out, and I read the first section, the light bulb went off in my head, because from an investor standpoint, you know, we'd always want to, you know, invest or buy shares in the company that was going to be the market leader, right? Because you knew the market leader would get a disproportionate amount of the market share, and it was funny, you could see it reflected in the market value of the business, right? And the second place player would, you know, they wouldn't do, you know, being second in a big market's not a bad thing, and third it could be okay, but you know, fourth you got a set of steak knives, right? You didn't get much, right? There wasn't a lot there, and so it was interesting to kind of see how that framed the idea in a lot of ways. But I'm curious, when you guys wrote that book, did a lot of people buy into the idea, or were they sort of saying, oh, this is a market share thing versus being different than sort of, this is a new category concept?
Well, what's happened since the book came out is that people read it and go, oh my God, this is like exactly, you know, either this informs me in a new way, like kind of you were saying, but we get a lot of like a CEO or CMO reading this book and going, this is what our company needs. Yeah. And which has led to like this whole consulting business, because they're calling us and saying, please come help us do exactly what you wrote about in the book. Yeah. But I mean, I'm sure there are doubters and people who look at it that way. And one of the messages that we go into when we first talk to any company is that this is not marketing, it's not positioning or messaging or any of those kinds of things. It's deep in your bones strategy. And if it's not that, then it's not going to work.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with this. Is some, you know, there's a little saying, marketing sometimes too important to be left to the marketing department. Yeah. Right. And this idea is not a CMO thing. It's really got to be a CEO, CFO. Everybody's got to be aligned around this idea to understand how you execute.
One of the things that I think really, you know, you kind of like when you're working on a thought project like this, you end up in these moments where you land on something that sort of vaults you into a new, like a new level. And one of those moments was when we figured out, when we thought about this triangle that, you know, is in the book, right? So the triangle is, there's three sides. One is company design, one is product design, and one is category design. And so classically, you know, company launches, and the first thing a company's working on is product design, because that's usually a company's built around the idea, we've got this cool idea for a product, right? So you're designing the product. And the next thing that, you know, you have a product up and running, and now we got to have a company to actually make this thing or get it out there. So you get into company design, which is kind of thinking about like what kind of company we're going to have, you know, what's the culture going to be, what kind of people we're hiring, whatever. And most founders just leave it at that. And so we realized that that the third leg of that is the idea of thinking about the space that you're going to go into, and is that new and different, and can you dominate it, or are you just trying to steal a little bit of market share from somebody else, which is usually a bad mistake. Yeah. You know, all these things about designing and building a new category. And we realized it's a triangle because they all have to work together. If you come, like you're talking about from an investor standpoint, if you come across a company that has a, you know, brilliantly designed product that's addressing a new category in a new and exciting way, and the company seems to be aligned around that and has the right kind of talent and position and everything, then you've probably got a company that's got a good chance to be that kind of category king and you know, take those economics. If any one of those three things breaks down, then then that's a problem. So so that's why this is a strategy thing, because the company people, the company design, the management, the product design people, the engineers, the category design, which is can be marketing, storytelling, all those kinds of things. They all have to be aligned, or it's just not going to work.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. They all have to work in unison, or you don't get that flywheel where you really can build the escape velocity, if you will, to build a big company.
And part of your point about marketing being too important for the marketing department, I mean, marketing is about creating that story, that concept, that message about what we are and what we're going to be, and in that triangle, I mean, that story informs what the product should be, and informs what the company should be, and for that matter, whatever the product and company are also informs what the story is. So it is a big wheel, and they all are interconnected. And the idea that marketing or storytelling would be this separate thing that tries to look backwards at what the company and product are, and let's figure out how to talk about that without influencing it, is just wrong.
Yeah, we're going to get into this a little bit more about some of the mistakes tech companies make, or even really any startups make around storytelling, because I want to get your opinion on that.
Okay.
But I do want to talk about the latest book. It came out in March, Unscaled, How AI and a New Generation of Upstarts Are Creating the Economy of the Future. Now, you co-authored this book as well.
Right.
With
Hemant Taneja.
And he was with General Catalyst, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about the story behind this book, because I listened to it. I didn't read it. I listened to it on Audible the other day. And it was fascinating, because as I go about my day to day, I started to see these occurrences pop up all over the place. And it's like, unscaled there, where you see these companies start to, if you will, I don't want to say outsource, but they focus on pieces of the value chain that's most relevant to them. So maybe tell everyone about what the premise behind this.
Sure.
This
Well,
book.
a little background and a little premise. The not unlike with the Vivek thing, Hemant and I started. We met. We started talking. He had this idea, which he was already calling unscaling, that was informing his investment decisions and his lens on how we would look at companies that came in the door. And he and I had a few conversations about that. And I actually thought it was so interesting that I wrote some columns for Newsweek based around those ideas. And as we kept talking, there was some point when we said, maybe there's actually a whole book in this, and we should explore that, and just kind of kept mushrooming from there. There's a couple of sort of central pieces to this. And the big, when this really got interesting to me was when we started looking at it as a big historical story. Yeah. And what we realized is that if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, from around 1890 to 1920, there was this incredible burst of technology like the world had never seen. That was when we essentially invented the car and the airplane and telephone systems and electrified the world and all of these groundbreaking technology. So the life in 1890 was entirely different than life in 1920. Yeah. And if you think about all those technologies we built then, they all created the ability for a big organization or company essentially to scale up. Yeah. Because before you had transportation or communications, whatever, you couldn't. And suddenly economies of scale and mass markets and mass products or mass production and that all became the goal of most businesses, because that was the way to make the most money. Make the most of the same thing for the most people was a recipe for success.
That's why they called it mass market, mass media.
And so for 100 years, that was a dominating technology, and so all the companies chased this enormous scale, and a lot of vertical scale. You own the distribution system, you own you own your computing system, whatever else you owned all that. Yeah. Around 2007 or so, when we started getting cloud, mobile phones, social networks, so media, online media, all these kinds of things started to happen. We started to create another explosion of technology that's still going on with AI, and blockchain, 3D printing, and all that. That was like that one 100 some years ago. But this new technology allows a couple of things to happen because of the way cloud works. For instance, companies can now rent almost all the scale that they used to have to build.
Yeah.
So that depositions every scaled up company,
Yeah.
because now if you can just be a garage startup and with a credit card rent everything you need to compete against Procter & Gamble, and you're entirely focused on a particular niche and making a particular product really great, you're going to be able to outmaneuver and beat out a giant scaled up company. Yeah. So that was one thing that was going on, and it's been going on for a while, right? So it's creating this idea that a small, focused, highly product centralized, focused company can beat any big giant. And then the other aspect that's sort of giving a lot of acceleration to that is what AI can do, because AI can start to, now that we're doing so much digitally, right? AI can start to learn about every individual customer and address those products very much, personalized, customized to you. And if a product is perfect for you versus the masses, I mean, that's going to win almost every time.
Yeah.
You want that rather than compromise and get what everybody else is, getting that might just be sort of mostly what you want, but not really. So now as we get those two twin trends of we can rent scale and build products that are that are aimed at an individual market, not a mass market, you start to take apart that scale that we had in the old days and allow new kinds of companies to reinvent whole different industries, even the big ones that we didn't think would be reinvented, like transportation or energy or in the healthcare industry. It's those things that were immune to
change.
The dot-com area are now getting reinvented by this dynamic.
What's fascinating to me is like the concept of mass personalization has been talked about for, you could argue, for like the last 15, 20 years.
Right.
And so the seeds of unscaling have been planted. You can think about, obviously, the browser being one piece, and you can look at some of the business models, even in the dot-com era, where they were heading towards that that unscaled approach. But the infrastructure wasn't, I guess you'd probably say it wasn't mature enough,
right.
if you will.
Didn't hit that tipping point. Right?
Didn't hit that tipping point.
Right.
And so do you feel like this 07, 08 thing, tipping point, was maturation of cloud? Was it, the rise of the iPhone and really giving you a, mobility? Or is it just sort of the all of these things converging simultaneously?
That was the start of the tipping point. Because what happened when you have social media, mobile phones, and cloud, suddenly, like, all of these activities that used to be analog real world activities become digital activities. Now your mobile phone knows so much about where you are, where you've been, what your communications, who your friends are, with the social media. We're doing so much of our shopping and everything is online. So all this data gets spit out about what you as an individual do. That really was a real launching point in around 2007 or so. So between the cloud making things rentable, between the data making things discoverable, and then you add AI, which starts to take all of that and make sense of it. Those things together have really been the transformational technologies.
It's funny because I remember, this is going back 15 years, we used to talk about the 360-degree view of the customer, right? But the reality is, you could argue 270 degrees of that view were analog. And you could never, you couldn't get them into that single view, right? Yeah. You could never capture all those touch points. So it's interesting to see how that's changed.
Yep.
Where do you see this being most applicable today in terms of businesses that you think are undergoing change?
I'll reflect a little on my writing partner Heyman on this. He completely believes that this is just going to blow up the healthcare industry.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about, because there's all of these we're having so many debates today about the cost of healthcare and Obamacare and how to manage all of this, and the technology actually make a lot of those worries and conversations go away.
Yeah.
Because as the technology starts to unscale healthcare and make it cheaper and better and more personal, it's now here's one particular example from the book. There's a company that we write about called Livongo, which Heyman was co-founder of. And
this was the one that really struck me, by the way, in the book. Yeah, because it's something that so many people have, and it's such a burdensome thing in their lives.
And to me, it's such a great example of why unscaling happens and what its benefits are in these places where we have otherwise been immune to these kinds of things. Livongo addresses the market for people with diabetes, and it's and talk about leveraging all these different systems that are out there, right? So it gives you a little mobile device that's wirelessly connected, that can take your blood sugar, but also asks you a bunch of questions all throughout the day of like, how do you feel? Do you have, are you getting hungry? Are you, sleepy? Just little questions that help inform some AI in the background to start to learn about your particular diabetes. And now, most people with diabetes today, they just get treated as you have type 1 or you type 2. It's the same, you go, it's just a mass market approach.
A or B,
And it's a mass market approach to treating diabetes. The idea of this system is that it gets to know exactly how it's affecting you as an individual, taking it from a mass product down to an individual product, and starts to help you manage it so that instead of winding up with a trip to the emergency room because you're passed out, you understand there's something you can do to prevent that from happening. And so you start to how many of those instances does it have to happen before you're saving millions or billions of dollars out of the system because you're keeping people, home and healthy rather than, in a doctor's care. And so if you multiply that in over and over and over again, and all these diseases, all these ways we're wasting money in healthcare, all these doctor visits we don't have to have, a lot of this problem is going to go away if we allow these technologies and these innovations to happen and to get out to the public.
Yeah. Well, and the healthcare one there's such an applicability in all sorts of research, and you think about sort of preventative diseases, and if there was a way to monitor, your not just your activity, but in terms of what's happening in your body, that if you can get ahead of these things, and then apply a little AI and machine learning to this and say, oh, you know what, it looks like you've got X versus Y, let's get you in early. All the downstream cost savings are massive on the system. So
Absolutely.
that's how far away, and this one kind of fascinated me, is how far away do you think we are from this being ready for, mainstream adoption, if you will? Because it feels like right now in the healthcare field, we're in the very early periods of this change. Like it's, because I from a personal example, I have one doctor I go to, which is like the most technically advanced service possible, but that's my general practitioner, which, okay, that's fine. And then I've got other ones where they're really high value, I break a foot, or I got this stuff, and it's the most analog, but that's the specialist, who needs to come in and look at, a broken bone or whatever it is. And there's two different worlds that are happening right now in healthcare where you can be in the future, and then you feel like you're in 1972. So I'm curious, how do you see this market evolving?
I tend to agree with you that it's really very early, and I think what you're likely to see is these companies that take off little bites, like a Livongo, and you're aiming at particular diseases. There's another company, in the whole range of what's going on in healthcare, right? Like there's a company called Verge Genomics, that's a hot young company that's using AI in some new ways to do drug discovery, and they believe that they can discover new drugs at a far faster pace, much cheaper, by doing it almost all inside of a computer rather than in a lab. And imagine if that makes drug prices go down by 10x. One thing after another is going to happen, but it's all going to happen on the fringes, and because there's also too many. Healthcare is a funny thing, right? Because it's also highly regulated. It's got all these different layers of insurance and
structural blockers to adoption.
Exactly. Yeah. So, to blow that all up is going to take, a lot, but it will start happening on the fringes and start, marching toward the core.
Yeah. I want to go back to a little bit on the media example, because there's so much going on right now in the news around the big mass acquisitions and roll up, which is the opposite of unscaled. And we touched on it earlier, but when you see what's happening with sort of the AT&T deal, and they got the blessing from the government, so it appears that we're going to go into a period of mega consolidation, despite what anybody else in the administration or anywhere wants.
Right.
What do you think happens with these things? Because your premise is they're defensive moves because of the threat from unscaled companies. What happens to the behemoths when they start to scale up like this? Is it a slow death?
Yeah, it's certainly a slow leveling out of what they're. There's no question, right, that the whole cable thing. I mean, Hulu's eating television viewing alive. I mean. Netflix is changing the whole paradigm for producing shows and winning an audience, and I don't see how a behemoth competes against that. It just is. I mean, one of the AT&T Time Warner, when they're talking about the merger, one of the things that they were talking about. There was a story the other day about they just had an all hands meeting with HBO to basically talk about how HBO has to try to be more like Netflix.
Yeah.
And so they're looking at what's going on over here and realizing that's where the future is. It's not what we've been doing. But like in any business, I don't know if they can react fast enough.
I read that article and it was interesting because it was like HBO needs to scale up.
Right.
It was sort of the premise, like you guys got to do more. But HBO's always been boutique-y to a certain extent, right? And I mean, It was X number of shows, and it was Sunday night is when they put the shows on. And so you look at HBO today, and you're like, it's always had great content, for the most part.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But it was always it was still fairly linear, and it was like you got your new show on Sunday night, and the opposite of what you kind of see with the Netflix approach. What do you make of what Disney's doing? Because that's the one, I think, the fascinating example here, because they have so much content. Mm-hmm. You could argue they've already, they have enough to make a run, if you will, at what Netflix is trying to do, just given the vast libraries that they own.
Right. And I mean, Disney will be fine.
Yeah.
But what Netflix is and others like it have defined is this idea that you can use data about viewers to and as some of the recent stories about Netflix have shown, it's not the decisions aren't entirely based on just data alone. I mean, they do have talented people trying to make smart decisions about good quality programming and all that, but it allows them to target particular audiences and assemble them from all over the world. If you need 10 million viewers to make a particular show a hit, if you get 5 million from the U.S. and 2 from Europe and 2 from Asia and 2 from, I don't know what that adds up to. But
yeah. It'll get you 10. You add a couple more countries and you get to 10.
I mean, a Netflix can do that, and has shown that if you spend your money wisely to make a whole lot of different programming for all those different particular niches, you can assemble a big enough audience to make a really profitable business. And that's a new way of looking at things, and it is, to me, like a very unscaled approach, right? It's about using data information to assemble a niche audience that's very passionate about what you're giving them, because you're giving them exactly what they want.
Yeah, and that's something that without the data you wouldn't be able to do.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that conversation, that story at HBO was, they were saying, well, we have to get bigger and broader so we have the data, because they don't have the data now.
Yeah. It's fascinating. We're going to take a quick break and come back and talk a little bit about what you're up to next.
Okay.
If you've ever met a famous athlete at a corporate event or gotten an official autograph, chances are Steiner Sports made it happen. Here's Brandon Steiner.
We believe that there's magic in the moments that sports creates. We get customers closer to the game and help companies use the power of sports to grow their business. We've been in business 30 years, and we've had multiple systems to keep track of all the athletes and all of our customers. Multiple systems means multiple headaches. So we made the move to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite lets us replace all of our finance, inventory, and CRM functions with one convenient system. Now all the departments can see the same data. And if I have a question about our business, I can get the answer quickly.
Find out how Steiner Sports scaled their business to millions of customers. Go to netsuite.com/Steiner. You'll also get our free guide titled Overcoming Your 5 Obstacles to Growth. That's netsuite.com/Steiner for our free guide and the story of a great American company.
All right. So I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the interesting things from your background and your story and writing these books is that you've actually started doing consulting now around the concept of category design and storytelling. So talk a little bit about how you got pulled into that. I mean, you used to write about what was happening on the field. Now you're putting the uniform on to a certain extent and getting down there in the trenches a little bit.
I know, it's a little scary,
right? You're mixing it up. So how did you end up doing that?
Well, certainly when I did the Playmaker book, I never thought I would be doing this. I thought I would just be, continue on and being an author, which is a writer, which is what I, know and like. But the book came out, and as mentioned before, we started getting CEOs reading it, saying, "Please come help us do this." My original co-authors were not really interested in trying to build some huge consulting business. Yeah. They just wanted to do their thing. And so there was more requests came in than they could fulfill. They started to pull in others, starting with me, but also some actually others from their network to start doing some of this work. And it's been a really interesting transition for me to be in that seat, and around the table at companies trying to help them understand how to define and develop a new category. And but the thing that I've realized now, of all of these people who are doing this, I'm certainly the only one who is a journalist as a background, a writer and storyteller as a background. And one of the things I realized pretty quickly was that what I'm doing with these companies is not all that different from what I have done for decades as a journalist. The idea is to go in and listen to them, and this is how I would approach the USA Today columns for all those years. Is I would always try to write about what some new company or product or direction meant. Like, what is it actually going to change, or how does it affect all of us? And so I find myself in these meetings at companies of really, you listen hard, you really try to understand exactly what they're doing and what they are trying to describe that they can do and the vision they see or the opening that they see, and then add in some of my knowledge or other research that I will do to try to understand the space a little bit better. And then put it together in a way that both pushes, that captures their thinking, but also pushes it to a little farther of what is this really going to mean? And if you do this, what's the impact going to be? And is this really big enough, or is it just being too much like somebody else? I would basically, create that story and spit it back at them and make them help them make decisions around, is that really what we want to do?
Yeah. There was a stat I saw. It was something like it came out of a professor at Stanford. I'm spacing on her name right now, but she had this stat that stories are remembered 22 times more often than facts alone.
Oh yeah. And storytelling is huge.
Yeah. And so the question for you is do companies understand the power of storytelling?
I think a lot of companies seem to understand the value of it, and they don't understand how to do it.
Yeah.
And especially in technology. I mean, technology is driven by engineers. I mean, it's driven by people with that kind of a background and bent. And they're not naturally going to think in terms of a story. And how to place it in context and how to appeal to people who don't really understand what the technologies actually does. So that's where somebody like me can. I actually, I feel like this is something you'd agree with me. I don't understand why every company doesn't have essentially a vice president of story, because it's that important to. Yeah. And we've talked about the PR, media whole. That function of how things word used to get out about things, it's broken. That doesn't work anymore. Companies have to own their own story. They have to be able to tell their own story in a really compelling way. And the story changes. That's why you can't just create a story at one point and
think it's going to last.
2 years later think it's the same story. I mean, it's a constantly evolving thing. And every company should be thinking about how to do that and do it on a regular, consistent basis.
Yeah, well, this is why it's really fascinating to me, because as I look at and if I look at like a lot of the tech companies, I think they tend to skew really hard to product this, feature that, right? And it's just, you can't even get the value or the benefit out of their story. It's really hard to pull that out of folks. Right. But your point on the PR side is like yourself as a former journalist, you can't go do a press tour today for a company like you used to do even 10 years ago, because there wouldn't be enough journalists to go visit.
Right.
And so what I find really interesting where you're going with this is, I almost think almost every company needs to think of themselves as a media company, right? As a platform to tell their story, and you've got to build. And it's crazy to say this, you have to build content, right? And build content in the way people want to consume it, and that to me is sort of a fascinating place you're going with your consulting work.
But there's another side of that I think is equally important, and that's the story you tell yourselves. Mm-hmm. And so,
what do you mean?
When we work with a company and develop that, that story about the category, one of the things that's forcing, and probably the most valuable thing that's forcing, is making a set of decisions that everybody can get aligned behind. Of this is our story.
Okay.
And in fact, I would argue that's maybe the most valuable thing we do for companies, is forcing them to all, the whole leadership team
talk to each other,
to talk to each other, and then agree that this in fact is our story. And then the first use of that story, again in our engagements, our situations, right? To us, the first use of that story is to turn around and tell the company that story.
Yeah.
So that, and going back to the triangle thing we were talking about, right? So you do that so that the product guys all understand what the story is and where you're going, and the HR people and the legal team and the finance team all understand the same story, and know that whatever they do in their job has to fit that story.
Yeah.
That's the first value of the story, actually.
It's a really interesting point, because you look at most companies, you can talk to one executive versus another, and they're probably not on the same line. But God forbid, like you talk to somebody, on the front line, and they have no idea how what they're doing ties back to their mission or anything.
And I would say if you took five executives from any one company and put them in a room separately, you'd get 5 different stories.
Yeah.
In most cases.
Do you think that's the mistake most companies make? Is starting there? Is this that lack of alignment around the story?
Well, yeah. Most companies start with a couple of people who are very aligned around the story, right? And you have a small team, and everybody understands exactly what you're doing. But within a year or two, that gets away from you. Especially if you start growing, you start adding people, and you start pivoting a little here and there to with a product, and soon the story's not quite hanging together for everybody anymore. And in fact, I think most of the companies we've ended up working with tend to be a company that's 3 or 4 years old, and started out and did what it started out to do, but now it got a little bit bigger, and now it's like everybody's going a little bit different direction.
How do companies keep that together? Like, what's the practical advice for keeping? Not because your story is going to change, but how do you keep the thread going so that you can keep people on the same page?
Well, over the long term, I think it is that
chief storyteller.
That sense, that chief storyteller. That story still has to be there, and at different times it's going to change. But you have to have a story that you all agree is our story.
Yeah.
And you have to make sure everybody knows what it is.
Yeah.
And that to me is like capturing. It's about capturing the culture and the vision and the direction of the company in one understandable place and way, so that nobody's unclear on what that is in the company.
Storytelling's too important to be left to the marketing department.
It is,
right?
And it is the way people understand how they fit in and what it is they're supposed to do. And if you get that right, then the company becomes a little more autopilot, right? Because everybody's got this thing in their head of this is how I fit in, and this is what I should be doing, and this is how I can contribute. rather than having a set of managers having to tell or force people to do those things every day.
Yeah, and that's how you reinforce your values and your culture and make sure that you don't have the missteps down the road. So, What's next for you? What else are you working on?
Well, right now I have been busy with the category design consulting stuff. This last book just came out. I'm kind of working on what are the next book ideas, and writing for a variety of outlets. I've just started doing pieces for Strategy and Business, the PwC's magazine. There's you can watch for this. I've been actually working with some former New York Magazine guys who are about to launch a new publication called Breaker, which will be kind of a wired approach to covering the stuff going on around blockchain and cyber currencies. They're planning on launching this month.
And the last thing I got to add before we go, you're also singer and guitarist in a rock band.
Yeah.
Where will folks be able to find you playing? Any gigs coming up?
We
tri-state area gigs?
We're taking the summer off. We actually have some stuff in October, November. Our band is called Total Blam Blam.
I love that.
There is a Facebook page for Total Blam Blam, which you can find any. Follow us there.
Awesome. You got a Total Blam Blam from writing about IBM to Total Blam Blam. That's a full circle there.
Exactly.
So awesome. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. This has been great. I've learned a lot. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jason.
Thanks. All right. Besides from turning you on to Kevin's amazing band Total Blam Blam, I don't think you guys expected to hear about Total Blam Blam, did you? I'm going to go check them out next time I'm in New York City. I'm going to leave you by asking this. What is your story, and have you made sure that everyone in your company is aligned with it? Thank you so much to Kevin for coming on this episode of the Grow Wire podcast. Don't forget to look into his new book, Unscaled, How AI and a New Generation of Upstarts Are Creating the Economy of the Future. Also want to shout out to everyone who made it possible, all of our sponsors, as well as our editing crew over at Lampstand, and our producer, Kendra Fisher. Adios!
You just listened to the Grow Wire podcast with host Jason Maynard. Make sure to tune in every week for another episode full of tips, tools, and strategies to take your personal and professional growth to the next level. Until next time.